Okay, so here we are for week 9, I believe, of the Weekly Sonneteer. And I've got maybe a couple of sonnets for you today. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to hop right into them. The first one is a poem by the African American poet Ed Roberson. And as usual, you've got the link down there. And we're kind of stepping outside the boundaries of where we've been a little bit with this sonnet. It's definitely more contemporary in style, but I'll go ahead and read it. You can follow along there. It's called Be Careful. I must be careful about such things as these. The thin-grained oak, the quiet grizzlies scared into the hills by the constant tracks squeezing in behind them closer in the snow. The snared rigidity of the winter lake. Deer after deer crossing on the spines of fish who look up and stare with their eyes pressed to the ice. In a sleep. Hearing the thin taps leading away to collapse like the bear in the high quiet. I must be careful not to shake anything in too wild an elation. Not to jar the fragile mountains against the paper farness, nor avalanche the fog or the eagle from the air. Of the gentle wilderness I must set the precarious words, like rocks, without one snow-capped mistake. I'll read it for you again. Be Careful by Ed Roberson. I must be careful about such things as these. The thin-grained oak. The quiet grizzlies scared into the hills by the constant tracks squeezing in behind them closer in the snow. The snared rigidity of the winter lake. Deer after deer crossing on the spines of fish who look up and stare with their eyes pressed to the ice. In a sleep. Hearing the thin taps leading away to collapse like the bear in the high quiet. I must be careful not to shake anything in too wild an elation, not to jar the fragile mountains against the paper farness, nor avalanche the fog or the eagle from the air. Of the gentle wilderness I must set the precarious words, like rocks, without one snow-capped mistake. Okay, now there's some obvious flaunting of poetic tradition with this poem in a very contemporary modern style. Uh, the total ignoring of capitalization. There's nothing capitalized here. Title or beginnings of sentences. Um, a lot of the quote unquote sentences. The segments of verse followed by a period that don't necessarily have a clear subject verb object sometimes, and so he's a lot of these are fragments, right? More than they are sentences. Um, Other things, just the what we one thing that really sticks out to me in this poem that we've had in some other poems, but there's this kind of thing called enjambment. Enjambment, Enjambment. Enjambment is where you don't have a natural pause at the end of a line. It just kind of spills over into the next line. So in the second line there at the ending, the quiet grizzlies scared into the hills by the constant tracks squeezing in behind them closer in the snow. There's no comma anywhere there or period or anything. There's no natural stop at the ends of those lines. It just keeps spilling over into the next line and the next line. And again, that's something called enjambment. Um, and I would say with that, one thing to think about as you're reading poetry, especially with modern poetry, is, we tend to think, I know people, my brother, for example, who, when you read poetry, it's like you tend to think, oh, at the end of a line, you're supposed to stop, you know? And it's like, no, not necessarily, right? The idea is follow the grammatical pattern until you come to a stop, right? Which is in the snow, period. Fourth line. And so, again, shoot for reading it naturally. Shoot for, reading it as if there wasn't the end of a line there. Not the quiet grizzly scared, into the hills by the constant tracks squeezing, in behind them closer in the snow. But the quiet grizzly scared into the hills by the constant tracks squeezing in behind them closer in the snow. And so, yeah, so this kind of, especially, you would get that with older poetry, like that you don't, if there's not a natural pause put in at the end of a line, then don't pause, just keep going, then keep naturally flow into the next line, right? But especially with more contemporary poetry, 20th century and into this century, this is the kind of thing you have. So don't stop reading at the end of a line. Rhyme scheme wise, yeah, you also notice where it's, well, no, he at every break he's got this double triple space thing he likes to do to show you, okay, this is where you're supposed to stop, this is where you're supposed to pause, and he's always got a period there to be like, this is full stop, moving on to the next thought. And I say the next thought because it's most of the time not the next sentence, it's just a fragment, which tantalizingly resembles a sentence without being one, right? It's more a series of thoughts with periods to show, okay, I'm moving to the next thought. And again, just kind of throwing formal traditional sentence structure to the wind, and even poetic structure, and running with his own kind of stream of consciousness, just spilling his thoughts out there thing. But let's look at the meter and rhyme scheme. Okay, so do you have the da 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 da? I must be careful about such things as these. So you've got the first 4 feet. A foot, I don't know if I mentioned the term foot before, but a foot is that da-da, 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 which is also called an iamb here, okay? So each 2-syllable segment, I must be careful about, those are feet. And also, because this is written in iambic pentameter, the da-da, da-da, they're also called iambs, all right? And so I must be careful about such things as, you've got 5 iambs, 5 feet. He's writing an iambic pentameter there, but then he ends on the unstressed first syllable, and so it doesn't quite fit iambic pentameter. And then the next line, the thin grained oak, the quiet grizzly scared. That's a regular line of iambic pentameter. Into the hills by the constant track squeeze. In behind them closer in the snow, the snared. So it may seem like he's not doing it, but he is doing it. Now I don't know, I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to make you suffer and go through the whole sonnet like that. But it seems like he's got this thing going on where it feels just random and scattered, but he's actually working in iambic pentameter here for a lot of this. And I'm not sure if he does that all the way through it, if he keeps up the iambic pentameter, but he certainly got it in there. The rhyme scheme, this is interesting. You have a lot of what I'd call slant rhyme. It sounds like it's trying to rhyme, but it doesn't quite in some places. So your first 4 lines there, scared and snared, clearly rhyme. These and squeezing don't, but these and squeeze does rhyme. And so it's kind of like, you see the rhyme there, and if he wanted to be a super stickler, he could have put a dash after squeeze and put ing on the next line. So these and squeeze would literally be the rhymes at the end. But as it is, he's given you more what's called a slant rhyme. You see the rhymes there, these squeeze, but he's also got ing thrown on the end. And then you've got dear lines 5 through 8. You've got dear and hear ing. And you've got stare and bear. The next 4 lines you've got, and this is where he kind of like, just lets it go. You've got gosh, you've got jar and far, which rhyme. Jar and air kind of rhyme, but not quite, so it's that slant rhyme, that kind of off rhyme. And then the line, I must be careful not to shake against the paper fart. You're really struggling to see how those are even attempting a rhyme, those 2 lines. But certainly jar and air are kind of an off rhyme. And then the last 2 lines, of the gentle wilderness I must set the precarious words like rocks without one snow-capped mistake. Okay, you know what? I was being confusing. So the first 4 lines, you've got a rhyme scheme going on, though some of it's slant rhyme. The second 4 lines, you got the rhyme scheme, though it's kind of slanted. And then the last 6 lines, I was being confusing there. He's kind of mixing the rhyme scheme around a bit. So shake, the first of the last 6 lines, that last sestet of 6 lines at the end, you've got shake and mistake. They rhyme. Okay, so shake and mistake rhyme with each other. Then jar and far rhyme with each other. And then air and precare rhyme with each other. And so he just again, he's not going Shakespearean at the end. The first 2 4-line segments make it feel like he's going Shakespearean with his rhyme scheme. But then in the last 6 lines, he's almost doing something more Italian, more Petrarchan. But he does have a regular rhyme scheme throughout the poem. Although it is an off rhyme, a slant rhyme at points. Okay, let's just go back and talk about the ideas of the poem. The title, Be Careful. What does this mean? Like, how so, right? And so we go into it. Does this mean make sure you buckle up before you drive, before you turn on the car? What does he mean by be careful? He says, I must be careful about such things as these. He's about to tell you what you should be careful about. What kind of things? The thin-grained oak. Be careful about oak trees. Thin-grained oak trees, because maybe they're easily broken. I don't know. Another thing you should be careful about. The quiet grizzly bears, scared into the hills by the constant tracks squeezing in behind them closer in the snow. So it's kind of like as society advances, as we build more houses out in the suburbs, the grizzly bears, they get kind of nervous and scared, and they have to wander further into the hills because there's like human footprints encroaching on their territory, right? The tracks squeezing in behind them, which make the grizzlies have to move further into the hills. And so you get the idea that Roberson's kind of talking about nature. Like, we need to be careful about watching over nature, and about the delicate things of nature. You don't really think of grizzlies as delicate, but their habitat being taken away, right? So be careful about the oak trees, be careful about the grizzlies, which human encroachment kind of forces into the hills. The snared rigidity of the winter lake. What a phrase. Snared, like caught in a trap. Snared. Rigidity, like tension of like a frozen winter lake. Deer after deer carefully crossing over the ice of the lake, stepping on the spines of fish who are lying frozen in the ice, looking up and staring with their eyes pressed to the ice. I'm a little vague on this, whether or not the fish are frozen in the ice or whether they're under the surface of the ice, like looking up at the deer hoofs as the deer are carefully walking across the ice. Um, in a sleep. So these fish, conceivably, these fish are hibernating. They're hibernating in the winter ice. And the fish are lying there hibernating, hearing the thin taps of the deer hoofs leading away into, like, the hills, into the forest. Uh, to collapse, they're going to go find a place to hibernate themselves or to rest away. To collapse like the bear in the high quiet. So the bear, the deer, they're all going into the hills to find a quieter place. The high quiet, the hills, right? And so Roberson is like, we need to be careful of these things, meaning don't bother them, don't disturb them. The deer and the bear that are looking for less disturbed places, and even the fish that are lying there kind of frozen hibernating in the ice, right? Let's be careful of nature and of quiet. I must be careful, Nine, line 9. I must be careful not to shake anything in too wild an elation. So Ed Robertson's like, I'm just a naturally exuberant person. Maybe Ed's an extrovert or something, and he knows he gets too excited sometimes. And so he's like, I must be careful not to be too elated, not too excited, not be too excited, too wild, and like disturb things that shouldn't be disturbed. Disturb things. I need to be careful not to shake or disturb things in my natural excitement that that need peace, like the deer and the bear wandering into the hills, the fish hibernating in the ice, right? I must be careful not to jar the fragile mountains against the paper farness. And so as he's writing, as Ed is writing, he must be careful not to. It's like, the mountains in the distance, it's like they're set up, they're against a piece of paper, that he's writing on. And he must be careful in his writing not to upset the mountains, if that makes sense, and it's interesting, you really do have a switch between your first 8 lines and your last 6 lines here. The first 8 lines are just straight up talking about nature, right? And how you can imagine him out walking around in the woods or looking out the back window of his house on the edge of the suburbs and thinking about, I need to be careful in nature. But in the next 6 lines, it's almost like he switches to talking about himself partly as a writer, making it less about the nature, more about himself and his own actions, okay? I must be careful not to shake anything. So it's about me and my actions. Not when I'm writing, I must be careful, what I write, how I write, not to just, in my elation and my exuberance, to disturb, to bother things that should be able to rest, should be at peace. Nor avalanche the fog or the eagle from the air. As I'm writing, I need to be careful not to cause an avalanche, of the fog, or not to knock the eagle out of its flight in the air. Of the gentle wilderness, I must set the precarious words. So the wilderness, the nature of my paper, is this something I've got to be careful with, because nature itself is a bit precarious. And so with my words that I'm writing on the page, I need to be careful that I handle nature gently. Like rocks. If you're climbing a mountain and there's rocks, you got to be careful as you pick your way over those rocks, right? Because you could start an avalanche, right? And so he says, Of the gentle wilderness, I must set the precarious words. I must gently set my words in this wilderness like rocks on a mountain slope, without one snow-capped mistake. I must be careful not to, as I set the rocks on my words in the wilderness, not to cause a single avalanche, not to avalanche one snow-capped mountain peak. Okay, so that's my take on be careful. And again, I'm certainly not the last word on this poem. And so I mentioned earlier that I might talk about two poems, but I think we've spent enough time picking this one apart that, feel free to elaborate on my interpretations, or if you got a different perspective as you were reading it, to come out with that. All right, see you guys next week.